years. It's really only been 10 years. We've been studying this disease called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, because before then, it was really largely unknown that you could have repetitive small injuries, small impacts to your head, like the kind you get during soccer or football, that don't even cause symptoms. It was unknown that those kind of exposures could lead to some long-term consequences. It's not painful when you suffer the injury. There's no bleeding. There's no sense that you're being injured, but it can have long-term consequences. And the disease that we've been discovering more and more about is called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is this progressive neurodegenerative disease that's triggered by small head traumas. And those are very commonly experienced during contact sports. American football is probably one of the greater risks, also boxing. But to a lesser degree, we've seen it in soccer and also in ice hockey, rugby, we've seen it in MMA. They've seen it, it's been reported in many contact sports, but the one we know the most about is American football. I grew up right outside of Green Bay. I know this sounds funny from people from the Northeast, but if you grow up right outside a football town, and my hometown is a small hometown, and it's where the visiting team stays, so if like Tom Brady comes to stay, play the Packers, he stays in my hometown. So it was a big deal growing up. Certainly the Green Bay Packers, because it was really, they were Super Bowl champion 1 and 2. So this is my childhood, and my brothers played football. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. My next oldest siblings, who are a long way away from me, 7 and 9 years older, were brothers. And so they just teased me and tricked me, but also taught me how to play football. And that was just part of my life. And so I loved football. I was a huge Packers fan. And then I started, and I had no idea watching the games that they were getting injured, that they were experiencing head injuries. I knew that their knees were getting shoulders, all sorts of other orthopedic injuries, but it had never dawned on me, even though I was a neuroscientist, that they were getting brain injuries. And so the discovery for me, my first case in 2008, in actually 2 NFL players who were very similar, both 45, both played 9 years in the NFL. And I saw in their brains this very serious deterioration, this accumulation of a protein called tau, but also this, a neurodegeneration. And I'd never experienced neurodegeneration in a 45-year-old. That seemed young to me. And I'd never seen it. And that was really the epiphany. And then just trying to really understand it, to see how common it is. We're still working on how common it is, but we're trying to understand its very basics so that we can learn how to diagnose it during life and treat it. Our ultimate goal is to examine the brains of people that have died and donated their brains so that we can learn how to care for the living. I still like football. I love the game, but I can't stand what's going on with the players. So I can't watch because I feel like, oh, maybe they'll stop playing. Sometimes when they lose, I think that's a good thing because then they'll stop. Well, they can play the games, but they have to remember to play them safely. And there's styles of play that are safer than others. So part of it is that. But part of it, too, is limiting tackling before the age of 14, limiting heading in soccer, because we know those are risks, and those are easy risks to minimize. So keep them out of tackle football before 14 at least. Maybe even consider 18 before they play tackle football. There are plenty of sports that can really encourage ball skills, running, passing, physical fitness, and it doesn't have to be head contact. I saw his autopsy photos because he obviously goes into a morgue in Pennsylvania. Here's this beautiful young man. I mean, he's just absolutely physically beautiful. You look at him and you think he's handsome, he's physically fit. I know he has a daughter. I think he had a wife. And you just can't believe that his life has been cut short. You find these, clear-cut evidence of CTE in his brain. They're undeniable, and he's only 26 or 27. And then you read about him, and you read that he was experiencing all these problems. He was concerned he had this disease. He was behaving in ways that he couldn't control, and it breaks your heart, And so it's stories like that you just want this disease to stop. You just want this disease to be the solution. You want to figure out how to identify it and treat it so it won't be affecting players like this. You just want to do something about it. So that's what that case is, and so that's what we are constantly trying to do, trying to understand more about this so we can do something about it. The one thing that's crystal clear in our work is that the number of playing years, the longer you play, the higher your risk, and not only the higher risk, but the greater your late life problems. So it's all about exposure and length and duration of exposure. So naturally, if you start younger, say you start at 5, which the people have started to do, and you'll even just play to high school, you still have at least a 10-year exposure. So that's one of the reasons you don't want to start early. But there are other reasons too. We think the developing brain is actually more susceptible to damage. It's not more resilient like people would in the past thought. It's actually more susceptible, and it doesn't cope as well with these minor injuries. So now what we found is that if you start playing earlier, you'll actually have greater later life consequences than if you'd started at a later time. We had a particular paper where you started to play after 12, and that was that was associated with fewer problems later in life than if you started to play before 12. And we have another paper coming out that's going to show more evidence that starting to play early just damages your brain and makes you not as capable of fending off injuries. And so it makes a lot of sense to hold your kids out of sports that require contact with the head until later. And then there are other reasons too. When you're older, you're physically more mature, you have greater musculature, you have an ability to brace your head on your shoulders and neck, you have greater neck strength, you have greater coordination. You've got these little kids at 5, they're running around with a heavy football helmet, they've got heads that are already heavy for their little tiny bodies, they're like literally walking bobbleheads. And they're not as skilled, so their head gets in the way more easily. They have more head impacts actually as a child than they would as a skilled adult. So for many, many reasons, it makes sense to hold your son or daughter out of contact sports with head impacts until later in life. Well, there's always going to be this subset of people that I think doesn't want to believe that CTE exists. I mean, there's very clear scientific evidence that this disease exists. I mean, at this point, to deny its existence seems silly to me, but there's still some people that deny it, and very learned and intelligent people. I do think some of that stems from their own personal investment in its staying the way it is. The status quo, maybe their research is negatively impacted by the CTE research. Maybe it's sort of negated or minimized. Maybe it's not as important as it used to be. That's what we sometimes see from scientists. Other times we see from scientists that get funding from some of these agencies that want the sports to exist at the same way. So there's some conflicts of interest, I think, that really get into this. And then there's a lot of legal battles, and there's expert witnesses, and people want to be experts on the side supporting the national leagues. So they tend to be very ardent supporters of the death of the research. The media, the media has their own agenda. They want readership or viewership, so they tend to sensationalize the findings. And certainly we've been criticized very soundly and repeatedly for the media's handling of our science. I don't think our science is sensational. I don't think we've ever gone beyond the limits of what our results actually showed. But the media, just because it's the media, it's going to make it a big story, sort of a. But in general, I'm happy about that. Because I do think we all sort of needed to be, to be bumped on the head with a frying pan or something about this disease, because it really takes a huge shift in our sensibilities to think about this disease as being real. And I think the media helped us realize this is real. I mean, every day I hear about another football player who's suffering the throes of this disease, and then on the other hand, I have these people saying the disease doesn't exist. I just don't get it. I mean, it's like, here are all these people that are suffering clear consequences. We have hundreds in the brain bank with this disease, and then there's people over here saying we're making this up. I just don't get it. I think eventually it's all going to iron out. I think as young people grow up and have children, I see it as a generational thing, where the generation that didn't grow up with this sport being such a protected sort of cultural icon, or whatever that is. It has a place in society that's really high. And when we have now this new generation growing up that doesn't really have that same reverence for the sport, I think they'll keep their kids out of it. I think we'll start to see colleges change, and I think in probably 30 years things will look very different. Isolated, well-managed concussions are very unlikely to give rise to CTE. Okay, we've had individuals come into the brain bank with 2 or 3 concussions, isolated. That's not the substrate that we see CTE. Although I know there's a lot of misinformation out there, and that's when people start to worry. It's really the little hits. It's really the little sort of what we call subconcussive hits, the non-symptomatic hits that can accumulate over time. And that usually means years of play, and it means maybe dangerous styles of play. So heading in soccer is more likely to cause long-term problems, and all the little hits experienced by football players, aside from the concussions, is also more likely to lead to problems. So most of the time when your son or daughter has a concussion, you want to take them out of the game, give them appropriate medical care, until those concussion symptoms resolve, and then you gradually return to normal activity and then the level of activity associated with the sport. We don't have a great handle on when things are going badly. We don't have a blood test, we don't have an imaging test, we don't have we've really got to pay attention here, because things aren't we don't have that. So a lot of it's just following symptoms and over time. As a mother, I mean, I have 3 kids. They all played sports of one type, all soccer, but I want what's best for my kids, and I want them to be the most productive, members of society with the greatest brain health possible. So I think really just understanding that you want to encourage your kids to participate in activities that will promote their brain health, promote their best success in life. That's what's important. And I think we get carried away thinking that each child of ours is going to be the next super athlete, and it's only a few of them. So put them in sports that'll encourage their brain health, which is physical fitness, aerobic exercise, and teamwork, and try to limit their head contact in whatever sport you choose.